so much, everybody, for joining me, and your support means so much to me. This book took about 3 years to do, and it's such a thing done in isolation that you don't know, is it going to matter? Is anybody going to read it? Is anybody going to care? And I released my first book in 2021, and that's a blur now for us because it was the pandemic, it was lockdown, loads of people weren't coming to church or to shop or to anywhere, everybody was masked, and it was probably the worst time to ever release a book. But the reason I wanted to write the Desert Elders book is because of a person that I found writing this book, and it was the Desert Hermit of Agrius. And then when I looked into him more, I found out that he had a spiritual mother who guided him, and her story wasn't known to me or known to many people. And she's an Eastern figure of great renown named Melania, which is why people in the East are sometimes named Melania, including the First Lady. That's her tradition that she comes from, Orthodox tradition. And so this spiritual mother, Melania, made a case to Evagrius: leave what you're doing, and you'll get to his story towards the back of the book. Leave what you're doing, take monastic vows, kind of straighten out your life. and he really respected her. He obeyed her. Went to the desert and had spiritual fathers out there, and really wrote a lot of things. Evagrius was an extremely educated, wealthy person who had reached the complete pinnacle in his time for being the bishop at Constantinople. It's kind of one of the highest ranking cleric positions you could get. And so he had kind of everything, and then he wound up, and I won't spoil it for you if you haven't gotten to that part in the story, but he winds up leaving it all behind. And there's a little scandal that happens with him. And so I wanted to bring his story to light, but also all of his contemporaries. So maybe just before we get in, I'd like to just open us in prayer, and maybe calm down I have some jitters now. And thank you so much for being here. I'll just open us up and ask God for some help. God, I thank you for these spiritual ancestors that we have to be an inspiration for us and inspire us to lead lives of devotion. And even though we don't live out in the desert and we don't live in ancient times, we know that they still struggle with all the same temptations and issues that we struggle with on a human level. And I ask that the book, that you speak through your Holy Spirit, through the book, to people reading it, and through me now as I try to explain it a little. And I thank you so much for your provision for me and your special care of me. In Jesus' name, I thank you. Amen. So one of the first things I wanted to do was point you towards a resource that I made to support the book. And I wrote if you go to just lisadelay.com, that's my website. But if you go to desert.lisadelay.com, that's a different website. And it's a website that I did just for the book, just for the release of the book, and to supplement it, because they were not going to give me any photos in there or any charts or anything like that. And I felt like there was a lot to learn and see. And so I wanted to make sure that was accessible to people. So if you go to this website, it's like scrolling backwards for me. There's this little thing, I don't know if any of you have ever taken, this was suggested by my editor, if any of you ever taken like a BuzzFeed quiz or like a Cosmo quiz, or like match with the best Disney character, which Disney character princess matches you, so I wanted to do something like that, but for the desert fathers and mothers. And so if you wind up going to this website, there's like 7 or 8 questions, I think, and then it'll pair you with a desert elder that is kind of what you need. Maybe you can come in. Hi. And it will pair you with someone, and then I'll send you a resource it'll give you a little information about that desert elder. And then if you send me an email with the name of that person, I've made another resource that's more in depth. And then beyond that, I've made all of the desert elders involved in that quiz. I put them all together, all that information together, and that's a devotional that you can get. If you follow one of these links to get it, there'll be some access to that if that's something that interests you. But if you go here, you can take the little quiz. It's like a 2 or 3 minute thing. But I just wanted to open this up to you because not everybody knows what I did with this, and it's not getting a ton of traction. I thought maybe some people. Now this is another thing I did back when I turned in the manuscript, I had some time on my hands, and I was kind of thinking, what could I do that would be sort of a different type of promotional thing for the book that could kind of draw people into the time? The time period is 300 to 600 after Christ. And so this is the time, this is best context, I'll tell you this straight up front instead of getting out in the weeds. So the first few centuries of Christianity were a time of incredible martyrdom. People were rounded up and killed just routinely. Churches burned down, and people were tortured to death and crucified, and all manner of kinds of death. So if you were a Christian, you weren't just turning your life over. You would probably die in martyrdom, and you knew that going in. It's not like, there's almost no stakes to Christianity now. People say we're a Christian nation, so we're kind of in friendly territory, but it was not really friendly territory to be, essentially it would be like, you were supposed to worship the Roman gods. You were supposed to worship Caesar as a god. And this was just, there was so much that the Christians were doing that were turning society upside down. So like one of the incredibly scandalous things Christians did was they said something crazy like, people are equal. and that meant the highest nobility, who had hundreds and hundreds of slaves, would be on completely the same footing as their enslaved people that they enslaved. Now, you say that, and people get pretty upset, and it turns the society completely upside down. Christianity said men and women are the same. Well, how can that be? Women are owned as property in marriage. There was all these kind of revolutionary, topsy-turvy things that were happening. It was super disruptive socially, and so the Romans are like, yeah, we gotta nip this in the bud. We gotta kill these people off, and it made people more devoted. Obviously, it chased some off, and some people will probably not get involved, but it also made people more devoted. And that was what St. Augustine said was kind of the miracle, is that the church could still be around by the time he was around. It was like, that the church survived that is a miracle, shows that God was involved in it. And so, so let me show you what I was trying to do with this. Oh yeah, wait, this is the best part. I almost missed the best part. So this takes place just after, this period of time takes place as a period of devotion when the Roman Empire, instead of like, if we can't beat them, join them and then take over and then do it our way, they institutionalized the church. So churches were getting bigger, and they were moving out of homes. Women were hostesses for the house churches, and then sometimes as these churches grew, then they would build something. But when Rome got involved, and they said, first they said, you're allowed to practice Christianity, we won't kill you. And everybody was sort of like, really? Are you sure? And then not that much later, and this was just, I'm telling you, just a couple years after, there was this, 3,000 people were just slaughtered, and their churches were burned down in just the Egyptian region. And then just really soon after that, they're like, hey, don't worry about it. Go ahead, practice. And so everybody's like, obviously kind of on edge. and then just a few years later, Constantine says, actually, it's just the national religion now. Everything completely changed. And I don't know if anybody would have foresaw that necessarily. And so, in some ways, the church got infused with a ton of money from the Roman Empire, and they got protection, which is nice. But immediately what started happening is, well, I don't want my son to serve in the military. I want him to go to church and be a cleric, and I'll pay my way in. And so all this corruption started with the infusion of money and the infusion of power. And like, well, if you want to go to heaven, you're going to have to come through us, the church institution, and we're going to make sure you do it our way, and you pay your way in. And there was just a lot of funny business going on. And so there were a certain number of people who realized, now we're in a time of money and power and wealth. And Jesus was a peasant. He had nothing. He had no political power. If he could have been king, we're going to celebrate Palm Sunday. Maybe they would make him a king by force. Was not interested in that. And Jesus was the opposite of everything that the Roman Empire and their church takeover was about. But one of the things Constantine is known to do is to begin getting everybody on the same page with a number of ecumenical councils. So Christians from all over the place, the higher-ups, let's get a creed going so we're all on the same page. Prior to that, it had been a situation where it was more like there different opinions and different ideas could be held in tension. You could argue about it, like often the Jewish people will do. They'll argue about the differences in doctrine and opinions, and then they have something to eat, and then they'll go home, and then they'll come back and they'll do it again. And that was kind of how it was out of, Christianity as a sect of Judaism, and it was done in many of the same ways with many of the same ideas. All of a sudden, no. Now you can be a heretic, and you have to go by this creed. If you're not doing this creed, or you disagree with this creed, excommunicate you, and you're out, or maybe you'll die for that belief, or you'll get chased into exile, as some of the church fathers were had been clerics and they had gotten chased into exile, like Athanasius. So this was such a weird time. This is such a weird historical time. So some of the devoted Christians in the cities said, what if we double down our devotion and do ascetic practice? Like we just simplify things. We simplify what we eat. We free our slaves, and we give up our wealth as an act of, in a sense, rebellion against what was happening. We give up our wealth for the sick, for the needy, for the dying, and the people who are poor and don't have enough. What if we just do that? And this started happening in pockets in Alexandria and Rome and other places. People were just deciding that they wanted the simpler life. And they started this asceticism, this austerity and restraint within their own homes and communities. But then some people thought, what if I kind of leave things behind and I live at the edge of my village and I kind of give everything up and be devoted to God? Then these hermits and these pre-monks started doing this. And then some were like, I keep getting bothered by people coming out wondering what I'm doing and asking me for advice. I'm going to go further out. And after a while, some of these places were 3 or 4 day walks away from any kind of major civilization. And so you had somebody like St. Anthony, who was following someone else and learning from someone else about how do you live out with nothing, with scripture and prayer and seeing people once in a while. How do you do that? And he had a mentor. And then he goes out, and then you can't live out in this way on your own. It's not like Amazon Prime comes and sends food and supplies your way. So you needed the church to help you survive out there, or you would surely die. So people would come out with bread or provisions or something like that. But when they were doing that to help out, the church was connected with these hermits as they began. They would say, well, can you give me a word? Can you give me a word of wisdom that I'm going through such and such. Can you help me with some of that? And can you pray with me? Can you give me a blessing? So Anthony is out there, and this keeps happening. People are like, I want to do what you're doing. So he starts getting a little cluster of people around him. And this is kind of how the movement started. And what's so strange about this movement to me, they start these little communities where they're together, but they're sort of alone together in their cells. But then they'll come out like once a week for communion and worship and to get a word from their mentor, their spiritual mother or father. And there were women's communities and there were men's communities. And what's so strange about this time is that at the height of this movement, you would think this would be, a little, maybe not popular, but maybe it would. There's 500,000 people doing this. It's a lot of people doing this. It's a major movement in history, in Christian history. It's like pretty much the biggest movement right after Christianity itself. And just to think that you could go on these 3 or 4 day walks to the middle of nowhere, and there would be an outcropping of people in the thousands. And there would be a men's community, could be a couple thousand, and a women's community, a couple thousand people just out there. And it's really remarkable to think that this happened, and it lasted for hundreds of years. But I never knew a thing about it. I did not know this history. And I was a pastor's kid in a fundamentalist Southern Baptist church, and it was as if Christianity was Jesus and some of these guys, and then this big break of things going wrong, and then the Protestant Reformation, and that's when Christianity sort of really started. So all this Christian history is sort of lost to me and not considered valuable in the tradition from which I came. And I've noticed talking to a lot of people, I'll say, have you ever heard of the Desert Elders? Like, oh, was there a hermit? Like, was there saying anything? But a lot of people in Protestant tradition just have nothing at all, nothing that they know about this time. But it was such an important time. And so that's kind of why I wrote the book. And this is the advanced copy, and I realized that on the other copy, the real copy, they take off what the book is about. And I thought it was like, so this is what the class is about. There's going to be this class, then an Easter break, and then 3 more classes where I'll just be sort of an overview of what's in the book. But this is what I'm up to in this book, if you haven't started reading it already. So Lisa Cologne DeLay, that's me, returns with this lively and accessible exploration of the desert mothers and fathers, delving into what desert spirituality can offer modern readers. For all that bewilders and bedevils us, the desert mothers and fathers can help us face our circumstances and ourselves. The Way of the Desert Elders asks, what if the desert elders from more than a millennia ago could walk beside us and nourish our spirits now? DeLay introduces us to a cast of characters who are both devoted and flawed. Like us, the desert Abbas and Ammas wrestled with gluttony, lust, greed, wrath, acedia, despondency, vainglory, envy, and pride. DeLay brings the timeless sagacity of these spiritual companions to bear with our own barren times, offering reflection questions, prayers, and suggestions for crafting a rule of life. And desert spirituality doesn't mean going it alone. It means finding companions to walk with us. With our ordinary longings and extraordinary commitments, the desert elders can lead us towards peace, growth, and intimacy with God. And that is, they wrote that, but that is really what I'm up to. I'm hoping that these desert elders is not just this information that we get about Christian history, but that they inspire us into closeness with God, intimacy with God, but intimacy with each other, because they were all about creating communities that benefited each other. And to get into one of these communities, because a lot of times they would start out building their own little huts to live in, and they would spend most of their time in these huts praying, reciting scripture or reading scripture if they could do that. And they would also, to keep their concentration on prayer for hours and hours and hours, they would often do weaving baskets or mats and things like that that would kind of keep them. I mean, I think of these, I think of like some people, and some people even in here who do like knitting as they're doing like watching a movie or something like that. This was to kind of draw them in and do something sort of monotonous, but to keep them focused. And then they might sell these baskets or mats as a way for sustenance for the community, for food and things like that. But what would happen is then a bunch of them would sort of gather, and then they might build a fortress around us, some kind of wall, because marauders could just come in, take whatever they wanted. Not that there was that much, but they usually set aside money for any visitors who wanted to eat with them. And if they were fasting, they would set aside their fast, and they would show great hospitality, because that was as if these visitors were Jesus. And so they would eat with them and provide for them if they were sick. And their communities were selfless in that way. The money wasn't for them, but they would sometimes raise money by selling these things at the market. And so these communities grew up with these fortresses around them. So if you wanted to join the community, you could visit. That was fine. You could stay for a little while, maybe a couple weeks or a couple months. But if you wanted to be one of them, it would shut you out of the gate for like 3 or 4 days to make sure you were serious. You'd be like, "Can I please join your community?" They'd be like, "No." Just like, "But I really want to. Are you sure you want to do this?" Because it was taking vows for life, and it was chastity. It was giving. If you had possessions or money, you were giving that up for the benefit of the community. So like, you have to really want this. You can't just kind of do it. You know, it's going to change your life. You're not going to have kids. You're not going to get married, and you're not going to have any ambitions you had for success or power or, financial security in your old age. Well, those are gone now. The community is your family, and they'll take care of you. But you're setting it all away. So they wanted to know, are you really in this or not? Do you really want to be in this or not? So people just sit outside the gate for 3 or 4 nights, and then they'd be like, okay. And then there was a whole process of introducing you slowly in, and you wouldn't even meet and worship for maybe a couple years until you were sort of guided by a mentor for a while, and in the scriptures, and if you were not converted and baptized, that would happen. There was just such a long process. So these were pretty devoted communities, and they lasted for a few generations of people. And I say generations sort of loosely because, again, they're not having kids, but like newcomers and things like that would come in. And then there came this time when they say rivers of pilgrims came to the desert, rivers. So like just tons and tons of people. And people began to do pilgrimages to the Holy Land to see the holy sites. And on their way there from either, kind of Egypt, we consider what we would call the Middle East, and even places in Europe, they would start filing through, and then they would visit some of these communities. And sometimes wealthy people would do this, and they'd have a whole entourage. And they'd come out there and they'd visit and they'd get wisdom. And then some of them would stay in the community, and some of them would move on to the Holy Land sites. And there are several mothers, if I don't know if you've all, how far any of you've read, or if you've read it at all, but there were some spiritual mothers who set up places in the Holy Land, in Bethlehem and on the Mount of Olives, that were these communities also. And there was a female community, a male community, and they would take in guests that were visiting the Holy Land, and they would offer hospitality to them. And they had their own communities that grew up there too. So this was just a whole giant movement I didn't know pretty much anything about. So it's just a lot of research, and thank you for hanging on for that. What I wound up doing is, last year sometime around, let's see if this will work, in June or July, I thought it would be fun to have an experience where you could go into the desert sort of in a video game type of way. And to get this video game up to what I want, it would be like, I think I told $10,000, so it's a couple $100 here. But what you can do if you go to the desert website is you can take this quest, and you start in Alexandria, and you find it here. It's free to play, but then there's like, it might ask, if you want more time, it might ask for your email. And I think it's like 20 minutes. It's not finished off, but you can go in there and you can find Evagrius. This is Evagrius here. And you can go looking for him in the desert. And you meet different people along the way. You'll meet, I won't click to it now, but you'll meet some people in Alexandria. You'll meet Athanasius, who's a bishop there. And if that's interesting to you at all, I hope you'll check it out. And I wanted to also show you some stuff that didn't make it to the book that I thought was pretty interesting in terms of maps. I keep scrolling the opposite on here. Let's see if it's here. Okay, so this is the region, and so I also want to mention that some of these places still exist. You can visit them now. My friend Phoebe, who's a Coptic Christian, went out last summer and she visited Abba Moses' community. And you'll read about Abba Moses in the Wrath chapter. And his community still exists, and there's still people out there living this way. So this is the region where it takes place, and I'm not sure how well you can see this. How bad is that to see? I don't know. This is Alexandria up here, and then it would be like a few days' walk. Kelia is one of the communities that has, Kelia is related to the word cells that they would make. And if you're wondering, like, boy, cells sounds like prison. What's that about? And there's a period in time where, for what we wanted to do with criminals is put them in a penitentiary for penance and thoughtfulness and reflecting on their bad deeds and figuring things out and getting spiritually right again. And that's why they're in a penitentiary, and that's why they're in cells. Because the desert elders said, sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. And I think the hope was, if we put people in these places to reflect on their crimes and it's debatable how much being in prison actually helps you to reform. So I just want to give you a sense of where this was, and the Nitrian Desert is up here, and so it would be a pretty long walk to get there. And then these were the various communities, and then this is an example of a fortified proto-monastic community. And so in these communities they would have, and this is why universities are set up this way too. So in some of these communities there's like a dormitory. The dormitory has a commons area, and that would be for devotions, like morning and night devotions. And then there'd be a chapel, a worship area, and then there'd be sort of a meal area, dining area. And if you think about it, there's very little difference now between how universities are set up, because the universities came out of the monastic movement in the Middle Ages. And monasticism started here and then moved to Europe. And then by the time you're in Europe. It's 1,000 years of monasteries really flourishing. And it was an entire way of life during this medieval period of time where there were 20,000 monasteries in just Western Europe alone. Forget the rest of the world. Forget these Southwest Asian areas. But monasticism was just an enormous movement that kept people. Sometimes it was the only solid thing people had in this time when the Roman Empire broke down and everything's chaos and little kings fighting each other for back and forth for hundreds of years, in this really kind of gruesome time when you could get raided and pillaged and all these things. And then there were these centers that were these monastic communities that were stable, and you could get an education there when you couldn't get an education another way. So this is really the beginnings of all that, and the way of life together, and how do you live together with these other people and not drive each other insane and not sin against each other. And so the book lays out, there's 9 virtues, and these deadly sins that you've heard about, maybe the 7 deadly sins, originally came from the desert period, and Evagrius and some of the other desert elders who spoke about vices and virtues. But Evagrius spoke about 9 of them, not 7, and they're different a little bit. Some of them are the same, and some of them are a little different. And in my other book, I talked about Evagrius and the 8 afflicting thoughts. And he didn't think of these vices as moral failings and sin, although you could cooperate with these temptations and sin. But he thought of them as like, hey, watch out for this. These are coming your way. This is going to be where we're going to wind up slipping up, and everybody's going to wind up slipping up. And then they got converted later to deadly sins, and like, well, here's where you're wrong. Here's where you need to repent. And it was a little more, I think, shame-based at that point. But Evagrius had 8 afflicting thoughts that he thought about. Then later, after living in community for a while, he's like, I missed one. Envy. That should be in there. That's a thing. And he noticed, living among these people who were like students of his and desert dwellers, proto-monastics, he realized that when somebody got good at praying or good at fasting or good at something, then someone else wouldn't like that. So there'd be these little competitions and these little fights and these little things. And so he writes about envy later. And so, I'm like well into the book, and I'm like, wait a second, there's 9, not 8? My goodness, you have told me that when I was writing this book. That would have been nice. Like, so that was a little wrench for me. And this is the one this is Abba Moses Monastery. And if you wind up reading about Abba Moses later in the book, he's the guy who was a crime boss. And he had 75 guys that in a gang of people that would go from town to town wreaking absolutely terror, murdering, raping, stealing. I mean, all the things, all the horrible things, the thug life things. And then in his old age, after being there for decades and decades, he had his own community. People would come from far and wide to get wisdom from him. And he's one of my favorites because he had it, the kind of life he had was so undisciplined and so insane that his spiritual father at first is like, so this might not be the life for you. This is probably not going to work out. But you know what? Live a righteous life. Find a fine lady and marry and settle down somewhere with a church community. And Abba Moses was like, I'm not going back to any old life at all. And he just cried for days until they accepted him into their community. He was like, I'm not leaving. This is my family forever. But then after that, they said, well, there's going to be some problems. I mean, you're used to having copious amounts of sex and food and alcohol and all the things, and taking what you want and having a terrible temper and killing out of anger. This is going to be a hard life for you. And then some of the stories of him detail just the hardest time. He was struggling and struggling and struggling. And this went on for decades, and he just was trying so hard to imitate Christ and be Christ-like, and he turned into the most remarkable, humble man. And it's because of his transformation he is such an inspiration for so many people. He's the patron saint of nonviolence of all things. Even though he's such a violent person, he's the patron saint in this part of the world for pacifism. And there, I won't spoil it for you if you haven't gotten there yet, but how he passes away is a really interesting story that kind of shows the transformation. Was an incredible one. So that's still there. Now, it's been ransacked a whole bunch of times, and they had to rebuild it. But you can still go in here, and I saw Phoebe sent me some video of, hey, I was at Abu Moses Monastery. We want to see it? And I was like, yes. So she sends it to me, and you can walk through, and you can see frescoes, and you can see paintings on the walls, and it's very simple and everything. But it's from that time. Let's see what else. Okay, I did want to show you. Let's see what more thing here. Okay, I wanted to show you this. This is a really interesting thing too. And let's see if it loads. So what wound up happening is souvenirs. Now, souvenirs were already a thing, and coins would get minted for certain places in the ancient world. As people had money to travel, they would go around and they would collect souvenirs, kind of like we do still. And they would mint coins, or sometimes they would be clay, and they'd be like pressed clay or something like that. And these are real artifacts from this time where you could go. I don't know if most of you haven't read this, you might wonder, like, what's that? What's that? And these are stylites who would live on pillars for decades. They would live atop pillars as a hermit, as a way of sacrifice. And it's pretty extreme. This happened a lot in the Antioch, Syria region. And when people would see, now the story goes, is Simeon, who wanted to do this, was like pestered all the time. He was pestered like, can you pray for me? Can you pray for me? And in his mind, he thought, well, if I go up high enough, I can't hear them, they can't bother me, and I can kind of have some peace and quiet for once. So up he goes. And you have to imagine, too, I need some water. It's on a mountaintop, but then it's like 50 feet up from that. And this is not times of really tall buildings or anything. It would have just been such a sight. So people flocked to see this weird thing. I mean, it would be like if you stood on your house for like 2 months, on your roof of your house, it's like 3 stories, and you stayed up there, you probably would get a camera crew eventually coming out. You would probably get some attention. And that's what happened here. And then people would start to shout up and try to ask him for stuff, and they would collect dirt from the base of this pillar and take it away with them as like either a souvenir, or maybe it was a superstitious thing, or maybe it was an inspirational thing. And so the community that grew around Simeon, and he had many copycats, and even some women copycats. And there's just a couple I mentioned in there. And they would begin to sell some of these so you could remember your time there, and you could. And then these became like collector's items. They started getting traded. I mean, it kind of went crazy. But eventually, if you think about all these rivers of people coming out to visit, they were wanting to get some of these, and it became an income for those communities. But I think, in my opinion, and I think this is somewhat a consensus, is that like it was turned into a little bit of a business. So, like, are you motivated to stay on the tower because you're just in prayer? Or is it like, well, don't come down, we're getting a lot of cash flow coming in? Like, I think that might have been a little bit of a tricky one. So I think that's really fun to look at those things. And I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of what's at this website. And then let's see if this is the one. Okay, so these are some examples of where they would live out there. You can see sometimes they were just cutting holes into the rock and living in these areas in the rock. And then and you could see, I don't know if you can totally tell, but there's loads of little places in these mountains. And these are all like little spots where they would live in there. And you can, yes, some of these still remain. And there's just like, they're just cut into the rock. And then sometimes they would make like earthen things. But the rock ones a lot of them are still there. one of the funniest guys, I think it's Macarius, but if I'm wrong and you've read ahead and you know to correct me, you can correct me. I think it's Macarius decides to like retire after his long life of starting these communities. And he heads off in a completely different direction, like 25, 30 miles away. And he starts digging out a new cave for himself to live in. But knowing that he's going to be followed, he builds like a cave within a cave, like a secret room beyond that room. It's like, nope, I guess he's gone. He's like, he's actually in the other room down where you can't see him. He really wants to be left alone. Just as, I told you I retired. Please leave me alone. And here's a map of this is the river, the Delta region in Egypt, where the Nile River is. And then some of these are along here. Some of these communities are all along, somewhat along the river to make sure they had something to drink, or they would be in wadis where they would get flooding there. Let's see if I have the other. And this is like an oasis or wadi area. This is hard to see, but if you get to go here on your own, this is like a timeline, so you can see when people lived and how their lives overlapped in the time period, and this is how people were connected, like who their spiritual mothers and fathers were, and how they were connected. And I think this is kind of an interesting sort of spiritual genealogy. If we think about our lives now, there were probably people, maybe parents or teachers or grandparents or relatives that are our spiritual ancestors or our spiritual mentors. And it really shows, I mean, we have one of these for ourselves, even if we don't know it. We have people who came before us, who poured into our parents' lives or our lives, and then we will pour into somebody else's life too. And it's really interesting to see how some of these people influenced other people and then their legacies that came after that. It's just something to realize that this is not unlike us. This is our life too. We're going to wind up influencing, if we're good or bad. I mean, some of these influences, we can wind up having bad influences too. Or we can become people who have put out legacies that are really destructive. But we can also have a spiritual genealogy or spiritual ancestry that people could look up and say, well, because of them is why I'm here now, is why I want to move towards Christ-likeness. So I really enjoyed that was available. And here's just some other examples of communities. This one's a little hard to see, but it's like built into the rock, like the whole church and everything. The whole community is there. And, you know, a lot of these sites had been around for a really long time. And then some of the sites in Syria, during the ISIS war, there was a lot of destruction of these places. And we do have the pictures and stuff, but world sites way prior to Christianity also were destroyed. So some of these things, we only have the pictures now. Let's see if I just have... Okay, I did that one. Okay. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but there will be some things I'm doing online that the last Lenten session is tonight that I'm doing online. It's a YouTube live thing, and there's for the last 5 ones, there's also replays available. So if you go to one of these, you'll see a link to go to visit and see the different themes of Lent. There's 6 themes of Lent, and today is conversion. That's the theme of Lent. So I'm doing that live today with a friend of mine named Mark, and then I'm also doing in a few weeks a book club. There'll just be 3. This says 6, but there's actually only going to be 3. So if you're interested in listening into the book club, which I'll have a co-host, and we'll just kind of be chatting about some themes, I hope you would want to do that and join us. And I think before I wanted to read just a little bit in the book, to speak about the book, I wanted to see if anybody here has read the whole book. Anybody read all of it? Oh, okay, a couple people. Thank you. And seeing how it actually means something in their life beyond just kind of an accumulated knowledge. So I'm interested to see what you think, like some of your favorite parts, or some part you didn't like is fine too. And also in the book, which is really cool, this guy gave these, my publisher made out like a bandit, I'll tell you what. His name is Greg Yingst, who designed this cover. Not the words, but these are woodcut artwork. But then on the inside, if you see, he actually designed these. He allowed these to be used. These were already designed. But I approached him and I said, I just love your work. I don't know if you could do the cover or do some things in my book, but I love it so much, and it'd be great to connect on this project. And so they said, we don't have money for that. And he said, they're yours. You can just have them. You can just use them on the book for free. So he's done many amazing art pieces, and I have a link to see his work if you're interested in his work. And this is Syncletica, and she talked about praying with weeping and repentance. And so he has her weeping into a bowl that she's catching all her tears. And it was a really sweet gift, a very generous, sweet gift from him. And I can tell I'm losing my voice. Does anybody have any questions for what I said? I know I just kind of threw a ton of things at you. What I'm hoping to do in the next class is just take one part of the book, because the book is broken up into 4 parts. And the first part is the temptations of the body, and then the next is the temptations of the mind, and then the next is the temptations of the spirit. And as we move in spiritual maturity, these are kind of the temptations that hit us first, second, and last. And the temptations of the spirit are things that when you kind of feel like you have some stuff figured out, I think I'm not doing too bad with the gluttony thing, the lust is probably under control, I'm not as angry as I used to be, then you start feeling pretty good about yourself, is what religious people do, including me. And you start thinking, I'm pretty, not like that guy, I'm not like her. And that's the parts that hit you at the end, the temptations of the spirit. And so those ones are, in here, they are vainglory, envy, and pride. And pride being described here maybe a little differently than some of you might have heard. So pride would sometimes be described as this rebellious thing that Adam and Eve did with the tree and the fruit, and they had pride and they thought they didn't need God and they could do it themselves, and sometimes that's one of our first understandings of pride. But how Evagrius says pride happens is that it sort of sneaks up on you and you don't really think you need grace like other people do. Like you kind of have it figured out. You kind of know what you're doing, and you're not, you're doing all the things you should be. You could check off the list of like, I'm going to church and I'm reading my Bible and I'm doing my thing. And then pride sneaks in this back door and it makes us feel superior. And it is such a barrier to community and to Christ-likeness, because we start thinking that we've made it and that we're not students and learners anymore. And Evagrius has such a keen insight. He was kind of this like master of psychology ages and ages before psychology ever was even dreamed up. He knew what people struggled with, and he knew the counteracting things you could do as spiritual practices and disciplines that could pull you back into God's will and in accordance with living like Christ with each other. He totally gets it. So he's watching and he's learning how people are living in community, and he's like, pay attention, this is going to come sneak up on you. And people will go to him as a spiritual father and say, I'm struggling with this, what do you think? And he was writing it all down. He wrote it all down, and he's like, this is going to get you through these tough times. And as soon as you think you've made it, be careful to think you haven't made it. Because pride, and then pride, he calls it a delusional sickness. We just are not acquainted with our humanity and our faults, and realizing we still have so much further to go. And don't get too excited about yourself. Don't get too self-satisfied. And he just has such a way of these keen insights. It really drew me into this kind of internal understanding of how things work. And then he talks more about, instead of making people feel like this big and why don't you grovel before God because you're just this little worm, he's much more like, let's do some preventative things so we don't just start sinning off the chain and just going wild. Here's some preventative things to do, like spiritual preventative medicine. And it's much more of a sort of teacherly, pastorly, come alongside you and walk with you during the ups and downs than it is sort of like I'm a big sage on the stage, and here's the thing you should do, here's the thing you should change, and here's the thing you should change. It's much more of a companioning. I just so much appreciate that about his attitude. And to think in these communities, some of these revered people were called Ammas and Abbas, fathers and mothers, just as a title, like an honorific. But amongst themselves, they were not called that. They were brothers and sisters. They were all considered brothers and sisters with each other. Not these hierarchies of, here's a big boss guy, and here's these little minion guys who don't know anything. They were all considered brothers and sisters. And I think there's a lot to learn in terms of, these are kind of the inspiring things they teach us about considering ourselves still learners, still trying to find, I think Steve says it often, is that we're beggars looking for bread and trying to get those crumbs, trying to learn from each other and not feel like we've achieved some special thing because we're special people that are better than somebody else. So appreciate Evagrius' attitude in that, and I hope that comes out as you read and as you go along in your reading. If you come up with some kind of question or you wonder something, I might not have the answer because I wouldn't say like I'm an expert in this, but I feel pretty familiar with them, and I might be able to field some questions. So maybe I'll just open up to anybody have comments about what she read or questions about the whole thing I vomited up just now.
That second woodcut graphic that you showed with the tears being caught,
Mm-hmm.
is that connected with, is that based on the Psalm verse that talks about God captures your tears in the bottle because he cares so much for you? That's not a quote, that's just is that connected with that? Or
I would have to ask Greg himself to know for sure. I think because she was so into what she felt like, there's this thing called the gift of tears, or compunction is another word for it. And the idea is that you begin to pray. For instance, this is how it can happen. You begin to pray, and it's not like you think, no one loves me, I'm bad, I'm horrible. You wind up thinking, and I mean, I actually almost feel like crying just now talking about it. But that you feel like so grateful for God's grace, so grateful for God's mercy. You feel convicted in your sin, but connected to God at the same time. And it's a cathartic, almost overflow of emotion and relief. But also, like, it's a mixed bag, too. It's a mix of, like, I wish I had this more figured out. All the things. And I think what Sincletica would say was that you should be praying with tears of repentance, and that should be your food. Like, because we're always in need of some kind of repentance. We don't have it figured out. We will sin in our minds even if we're not sinning in our words. And she's a really an interesting person who wound up having this terrible bout of cancer and how she died in this extremely gruesome, prolonged death. And it is said of her, and I think this is why she's so well remembered, is that she was incredibly sweet and incredibly still guiding the ladies under her care, even in the most gruesome moments. And her face was completely disfigured, and it smelled of gangrene. It was bad. And she just suffered and suffered and suffered and stayed so Christ-like the whole time that she's just incredibly revered. And the kind of spiritual mother that women couldn't stop. Like, she didn't necessarily want a group of hundreds of women to be in charge of, but they wouldn't, like, leave her alone. They kept saying, we love you so much. Can you teach us something? Can you tell us more? And she was from this wealthy merchant family, and she had a blind sister. And her brothers, who would have maybe inherited this merchant business, they died. And so all the money went to her. And she had a lot of guys stepping up like, oh, let's get married. Yeah. And she's like, I think I'm going to the desert. Actually, no. And she wound up funding a lot of these monastic communities and their building projects, and then taking in visitors who were visiting the Holy Land. and mentoring women, and men would come there too and gain her wisdom. And so she's just such a neat character. And she has, when she talks about things, she usually talks about it in these seafaring ways. That she'll talk about boats and ships, and because that's her background. Interesting character, my favorite mother, I think. Watch this portion here in the book. Sometimes people we admire have fascinating backstories and checkered pasts. Did anybody see that? Page 35. I won't spoil it for you, but it is about someone in this room. Um, and I once I heard that Jane dated an astronaut. I was like, "You're going in the book. That's it. You're going in the book." So, does anybody have any other questions that came up?
What sparked your interest in this particular story, and when did you start to write this book?
Let's see. What's the year? I was having a conversation with this woman named Carmen Afacedo Butcher, and she wrote a translation of the book called "Practicing the Presence of God." And it's a wonderful little book, whether you get hers or there's other copies out there. And it talks about this monk in I believe it's the 1200s. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, but Brother Lawrence was this monk who just talked with God all the time in conversation. And it's one of my favorite devotional classics. It's just about how to take God with you in every single moment and realize the presence of God is actually, the presence of God is with us now. The presence of God is in you. The presence of God is in me. And he was living that out as if he believed it, as if it were true, as if he felt that God was with him in every word, in every moment, in every instance. And it took him from being a one certain kind of grumpy person with some issues to this incredibly loving, gracious person that was very much like Jesus. And then people would just write him letters, get his advice. Clerics, he was just a monk, he didn't have any education. Clerics who were very educated would come to him for advice. What are you doing? How's this working for you? Because he would feel like when it was prayer time, he's like, well, I've been praying all day. I don't have a prayer time. I'm in what Paul calls unceasing prayer. So this woman who wrote this translation of the book was talking about some of the elders, and she said, well, you wrote about Evagrius. Do you know about Syncletica? And I was like, Singwatica? What? I didn't know her whatsoever. She said, oh, you would love her. I know you would love her. You should write about her. And I thought, I don't think there's a whole book there, but I'll see. And she was so inspiring. And then I found the other mothers in there and the other fathers who were just so amazing. Like there's such a weird cast of characters. There's this guy I hope that Peter Dinklage could play in a biopic on Netflix one day. He's the dwarf. He's the guy, John the dwarf, who's like, super small, but he was so beloved that his Abba said he had everybody just wrapped around his little finger, his really, really little finger. That he was just such a sweet, sweet person. And it's in the book, but one of the stories about Abba John, the small, they had to rub it in his face, I guess, that his Abba said, just took a twig and just stuck it in the ground. And he wanted to, I guess, help Abba John to not get too big in his britches, maybe, or I'm not sure. There was probably multiple spiritual lessons there. And he goes, water this every day until it blooms. It's like, oh crap. Now the water was like 12 hours away by walking or something. I can't remember actually. I'm not sure that was but it took him, he'd have to walk somewhere, get water, and then walk back the next day. And he was watering it for years. And as the legend goes, it sprouted and fruit came out of that. And he was diligent and obedient and faithful. And then his Abba said to him, this is the fruit of obedience. This is what that looks like. And I think obviously there's a spiritual lesson there. There's the spiritual thing about faithfulness and our obedience bearing fruit too. There's just so many great characters. I want to see Peter Dinklage on Netflix do this. Who else would do it better than him, right? Yeah, the South Pole elf and Game of Thrones guy. But he's such an inspiring figure. And Tim, maybe you can help me remember this. We were watching like something that Martin Scorsese did about the elders, right? Is there something out there? Or was it him? Was it Martin Scorsese or was it somebody else?
They were doing it about the violent guy.
Moses. Yeah. It was really interesting to me that Martin Scorsese has a Catholic background and was inspired by some of these people too. And so he has a few things out there. I think we saw that on Netflix, but I'm not sure. Was it Netflix? It was Amazon Prime. And if you are interested in learning about some of these people, but like from his point of view, from his filmmaking, and he's kind of interviewed in it a little bit about how he found them inspiring and why he wanted to do it. I thought we kind of stumbled on that by accident, but I thought it was really good. I thought it was really intriguing and really well done. And so he kind of like, see, there's people out there. There's some movie people out there. You could get Peter Dinklage to do this. This is not pie in the sky. I want this to happen. Let's do a letter campaign. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. What I'll wind up doing next time after Easter is going over the first part in the book. So if you read the introduction and the first 3 chapters by 2 weeks, maybe we can delve in more deeply. And what I'd like to do is not just talk here the whole time. I actually kind of hate doing this, but to actually put questions out to kind of engage with an answer, and then we can kind of learn together and not just me just talking from this lectern kind of way of doing a class, but just to kind of engage the material. And please keep in mind that I'm kind of hoping that you really mark up your books. If you get books, that you really highlight them and write notes. And then for each end of each chapter, there is a section, I hope that it gets taken seriously, but there is a reflect and respond area, and there's a prayer area. And if you do that as like your devotions for that week or for a few days or something, and you really allow the book, it's not my words, it's like the themes and the stories that I'm just bringing to life. But if you allow it to change you, and you pray the prayer, and you allow it to really sink in and settle into you, I think that God will not just be glorified, but that may more manifest in your life. Because as I was writing this, I had to submit to those teachings. I had to let it change me. And I'll just let you know that I have every single vice really bad. I did not come out unscathed. Like I thought, I bet you I'm going to be a little bit better at some of them than others. No, I won't be. No, I'm really bad at all of them. And it was very convicting. I didn't cry a bowl of tears, but I felt like that God does speak to you through the lessons and through these figures and through these ways of becoming more like Christ. If we take it seriously, if we allow it to change us, but it is painful. I'm not gonna lie. It's not like this felt good sometimes going through this when you realize this particular issue makes me really angry, and I can't let that go. And I talk about how wrath is stored anger, but anger is an emotion where it's okay to have emotion. It's a normal human thing, but if you keep it, it has no shelf life at all. And I'm like, but that's me. I'm doing that. I'm doing that thing. And so I really sometimes just wish I was writing fiction totally and not writing something that would be helpful and painful too. So that's what I'm hoping is that it makes some kind of impact for you, some kind of real difference in some way, and then throughout the book, if you see, there's these little parts, and these are the sayings of them that get pulled out in these little call-outs. And those are really wonderful nuggets. What I've found as a spiritual practice is take one of the words or one of the sayings of the Desert Elders, and maybe you want to write some things down about your thoughts about it, how it might pertain to you, and then just pray with that idea before God. And just like, so let me see if there's one I can find. Well, it'll not work now, but... So this one is, they say of Alma Sarah that she was attacked greatly by the demon of fornication. I don't know if that applies to anybody in here, but for 15 years. What's that? So she was greatly attacked by the demon of fornication. If you don't know what that is, ask Sue later.
I'm wondering, is that a bad thing for her?
It is. Yeah, she was trying a no-sex situation. I don't know if you came in late, but... that was a bad thing. Lust and fornication is like a total no-no for her. And she had issues. She was wanting to get her groove back in a big way for 15 years. And she says that she never prayed for that to go away, that she just prayed for God to strengthen her. And and you can, whether it's fornication or that applies to some other thing, that sometimes the lesson there is that, sometimes we'll pray to overcome. Let me overcome, let me get through this. And that actually just praying for God to strengthen you is prayer enough. That is a wise prayer that you can ask, God, I don't know how to get through this. This is a hard time. Just give me the strength. Just give me the strength. And whether it's about fornication or lust or anger or any of the other temptations or just something in your life, you can pray that, and I think God honors that prayer, and it kind of covers a lot of bases. And I think maybe we're out of time. But I appreciate you so much being here, and I hope that after Easter you come back and we can have some good discussions. And thank you so much for supporting my book. I appreciate it. Thank you.